Hey there, welcome into the Unpaid Interns podcast on this Friday afternoon. I'm Griffin Epstein. Thanks so much for joining us. We are almost at the end of the year for IU Athletics, so we're taking some time today to recap, reminisce, and look forward on the state of IU Athletics. We have a great guest to talk all about it. Jon Blau joins me today. He's the IU Athletics reporter for the Bloomington Herald-Times. Jon, appreciate you coming back on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And I'll start with this, Jon. Obviously it was probably one of the most challenging years just for college sports trying to play through the pandemic. How do you feel overall, IU handled it now that we're kind of at the back end of the year?
I guess, do you mean in terms of university-wide or in terms of the teams, in terms of their success, I guess?
Yeah, university-wide, the teams getting through it. I mean, just so many factors that everyone really had to deal with throughout the pandemic and trying to play sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think they handled it about as well as anybody could. I mean, there were outbreaks. I mean, I think basketball, football, they all had to shut down at different points in time. Obviously, football missed the last couple Big Ten regular season games, couldn't play in the crossover because of a COVID situation, but it happened nationwide. I mean, it was one of those things where it was hard to contain, especially on a college campus. There weren't any massive outbreaks where you think they couldn't get through. I mean, obviously, football had an historic season. Basketball was able to play pretty much all of its games. I think all of its games, right? I don't think there were any issues there other than on the other side, Michigan State. But definitely a hard year. I mean, just aside from just the stoppages, just mentally, I think this was an issue we talked with athletes a lot about, just the grind of, getting up. I think the basketball team got up at like 8 in the morning every day, getting a nose swab, having to deal with that, not being able to live a regular college life with your friends and just playing games one after the other. And we saw how hard it was for the basketball program. Obviously, a much different situation for them, but I think everybody got through it. Seems like the light at the end of the tunnel is here. Obviously, with vaccinations, the hope is that life will be getting closer to normal soon. Recruiting starting back up in June. So I would say everybody got through it. I think that's kind of the best way to summarize it.
There was some big news just this morning, and I know we're kind of still digesting it, but Pamela Whitten was announced as IU's new president, taking over for Michael McRobbie starting July 1st. No, we don't know too much about her just yet. But what are your kind of initial reactions to how this affects IU athletics?
It's that I don't know. I mean, it's always a mystery when you get a new president. Michael McRobbie, I know there were some critiques in terms of, how much did he care about athletics? How often was he at, athletic events? How much did he talk about athletics? I mean, I think he was very much of an academic-minded president. So I think people on the athletic side would like to feel someone's a little more engaged in that aspect. But at the same time, I mean, you think about the end of his tenure, they gave Tom Allen a giant raise. I mean, they he approved the change from Archie Miller to Mike Woodson. He's done things that people want for the most part. So it hasn't been, I think you could fairly look at it on both sides and say it could be, better. But then again, how much better really? And that's always the question with a new president is how engaged are they in terms of athletics? How much do they care about that aspect? Obviously, you're the president of the university, so you would hope academics probably come number one. But how big of a secondary thing is that for you? And I think I saw someone tweet out an article where she said, she wanted Kennesaw State athletics to be a big deal. And I think people were happy to see that. She seems like she has some interest. I don't know how much, but yeah, you just want the president to either, one, stay out of the way, just let the athletics department do what it's going to do, or be a proponent for it. And we'll see, how she interacts in terms of athletics with that side of things.
It will be interesting because Kennesaw State obviously nowhere near the level of an athletic program as IU, Big South for most of its athletic teams, and then football is in the FCS. Want to kind of do a run through of some different sports, and we'll start with men's basketball just because they've had the most news of late. Somehow it was less than 3 weeks ago still that they hired Mike Woodson. There's been a flurry of activity, and mostly it seems overall pretty positive from the program. covering the program, going to these press conferences, what's kind of your, overall feeling of where this program is and maybe how it's changed going already in these last 3 weeks from Archie Miller to Mike Woodson?
Yeah, I mean, whether it was all Archie Miller's fault or not, I mean, there was a lot of apathy at the end of the day in terms of where the program was going. It was just hard for people to look at the product on the floor with the 6 straight losses end of the season and say, well, there's a positive vision for where this is heading. And so they opted for a reset. And obviously that one donor with $10 million potentially that they may have to pay out to buy out Archie Miller's contract. That was a bold move. I think that set everybody's expectations maybe a little high. I mean, you look on Twitter, obviously, and everybody's saying, Brad Stevens, I think, is the God person that everybody wanted to come back, but that wasn't going to happen. And then it's just kind of what's after that. And it's surprising to some people because he was a, long-time professional coach. I think a lot of people like to knock that, but then I think they heard from him. They kind of heard his passion for the university, obviously, as someone who played for Bob Knight. Who cares deeply about this university. You learn more about him as a coach. Yeah, his winning percentage doesn't look great. When you look at it, I think, 460 or something like that, 46% win percentage. But then you look at the franchises he had. I mean, the Knicks and the Hawks weren't exactly like stellar teams that he was taking over in franchises, and those franchises haven't exactly done well since he's been gone either. And then obviously he's an assistant with the Knicks recently, and they've been doing a little bit better. So I think the more you hear about Mike Woodson as a person, his passion for the university, his ability, understanding of the game of basketball and where it's heading as an NBA guy. Anybody you talk to vouches for him as an X and O's guy. And then what happened, the first couple of weeks of him being here, I mean, being able to retain Trace Jackson Davis, who was thinking about going to the NBA, be able to bring back 4 out of the 6 that were in the transfer portal. You do lose Armand Franklin, which hurts, but you bring back Race Thompson. You bring back Christian Lander and Jordan Geronimo, 2 guys with some upside. You bring back all those guys, and there's a feeling of optimism now about what's going on. And then you add on the assistant coaches that he brought in with Dane Fife, who was 10 years at the side of Tom Izzo, and then Kenny Hunter bringing him back, and now you see a Rosemont. So yeah, no, it's been a really busy couple of weeks since he's been hired, and I think that at first it was maybe a little bit of surprise, but I think it's moved towards optimism about where things are heading.
Yeah, most of the pieces of the puzzle have already been filled in very quickly for what this upcoming season is going to look like. The couple last pieces are IU still does have 3 scholarship spots open. Mike Woodson has said he's still out looking in the transfer portal. What kind of players do you feel like IU needs, kind of players that they're targeting potentially for this upcoming season as they try to add 1 or 2 more pieces?
Yeah, it's 2 scholarships open. If Joey Brunk had come back, he wouldn't have counted. So it was 2 regardless of whether Joey Brunk came back. Obviously, he's looking elsewhere now. But yeah, they've said it multiple times. Shooting, I think, is the main priority. Mike Woodson wants to play a 4-out, 1-in style. If you're going to, play with 4 out, you better have guys that can shoot and stretch from the perimeter. And you have a couple of those guys potentially in Parker Stewart, the other guy who came back from the portal, midseason transfer from UT Martin. We didn't actually get to see him, but supposedly he can hit the 3 at a pretty good clip. But you need more of those guys, especially with Armand Franklin leaving, who is your best 3-point shooter. That's definitely going to be a priority. Whether they target the 3 or the 4, I mean, those are pretty good questions. Or the 5 now that Joey Brunk's not coming back. But yeah, they do have up-and-coming 5 in Logan Duncombe, who is coming in. So I would think that wouldn't be the main priority. I would think it would be maybe another 3 or somebody who can stretch, for both. I think both of those spots, as much shooting as you can get, would be important. But if you can bring in a big body who can play and gives Logan Duncombe a little bit of an opportunity to sit back and develop a little bit more, I don't think it's a bad thing either. So I think it's the best player you can get that fits the style that Woodson wants to play. I think that's what you go after. But shooting definitely at the top of the list.
Last question for you on men's basketball. The last 2 coaching tenures for IU have kind of been opposites. We saw in terms of style, we saw Tom Crean with a heavy up-tempo offense, not much focused on his defense, which lagged behind. pretty much the opposite with Archie Miller, very much a defensive first coach, and most of the struggles, especially the last couple of years, started with the offense. What are you kind of expecting with Mike Woodson's style when the team takes the floor for real in November?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think he's talked up both sides of the ball. I mean, he's talked about obviously that 4 out, 1 in, wants to be able to shoot it, wants to be able to push the tempo, wants to be able to do all those things, which might suggest maybe, well, you're going to steal some from the defensive side of the ball. But I think he's also talking about, he's one of those relics from the Bob Knight era. They obviously cared about defense back when Bob Knight was the coach, and I think that Mike Woodson cares about defense too. He says obviously they're going to switch a lot. He wants to be able to have a lot of versatility on the defensive end, be able to play guys who can guard 1 through 4, things like that. So he's talking about it, how it actually pans out, what they actually play. I'm not actually sure. I know it definitely probably won't be pack line. I think we've had enough of that. So that will be gone. But what type of defense they play, I think he wants – I think Kenya Hunter even said this yesterday, which I think was actually a kind of under the radar thing, but important, that he said he wants the conditioning level of the guys to be at a higher level, because I think he wants to play up tempo. He wants them to play hard on both sides of the floor. And maybe that was something that was a little bit lacking last year. You had a guy like Trace Jackson-Davis playing way too many minutes, getting kind of gassed at the end of games, especially when they went to, overtime, double overtime. So it kind of suggests to me that he wants to run, he wants to push the pace, but that does start on the defensive side of the floor in terms of you being up in people's faces. Rob Finney being really important, it's kind of the head of the snake there, forcing turnovers and maybe being a little more aggressive in some ways. But yeah, no, it's going to be interesting to see. At this point, it's all speculation. Coaches always talk about playing up tempo. Coaches always talk about playing hard-nosed defense. They talk about everything, and then we see where it kind of how it hashes out. But that remains to be seen until next season. We just kind of got to wait.
Well, men's basketball is still trying to develop and be a consistent top 25 program. On the other hand, Terry Morin and the women's basketball team very much proved this year they are one of the top, probably at least 25, if not even higher teams in the country, as they made a run to the Elite Eight. The big offseason storyline for them now is they've played about 2-3 weeks since their season came to an end against Arizona in the Elite Eight. Ali Papper deciding to return for her 7th season. Were you surprised by that? And now you see, all 5 starters coming back. What does this mean for the team going into next year?
I was not at all surprised, Griffin. I actually tweeted this when they announced the NCAA.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
winter athletes another year. I said, could we see a 7th year of Ali Papper at IU? And it actually did happen. It's an interesting situation. I mean, she obviously missed a lot of basketball at the front part of her career. She's just an interesting story in general. She goes to Notre Dame. She's missed basketball in Indiana from Columbus North. She has a knee injury as soon as she gets there, pretty much. I mean, like right on the eve of the season. Doesn't get to play at all. And then she comes back, but she develops an illness. She's just not feeling well. So she's there for a few years, and then, she finally takes herself to Bloomington and decides, I need a fresh start. And when she first got here, it was kind of a question of what Ali Papper are we going to see? I mean, she's obviously this great recruit, this great player in high school, but you just haven't seen it at the college level at all. I mean, her best season in Notre Dame, I think she was averaging like a couple points a game in that second season when she came back. She redshirts at IU. She actually has to sit out. That one-time transfer rule isn't there. And then now she's going to have a complete 4 years at IU. And she was everything you thought she was in high school. I mean, she had to, obviously come back from all that with the injury and the illness and all of that and get back up to speed. And that took time. But once she did, I mean, she's long, she's athletic, she can shoot it for the most part. She kind of slithers in the lane and gets in there and makes plays, and she makes everybody else around her better. And I think the main thing about Ali Papper is just culture-wise. I mean, just the perfect leader for your program. I mean, I don't think anybody has a bad word to say about Ali Papper. I mean, when you talk to anybody on the women's basketball team about Ali Papper, she's just the nicest, sweetest person, but she's also the most competitive person. She's this interesting mix as a person. And she kind of solidified and kind of created this foundation and talked about it before in a series of tweets, just from Tyra Buss and Amanda Cahill, who are kind of the 2 pillars that kind of started this whole thing, with a bunch of really important pieces around them. to bridge to Brenna Wise and Allie Patberg, the two transfers who came in at those same exact positions the next year. For Allie Patberg to come back another year, it gives you a chance to continue to bridge this thing forward, especially with Grace Berger alongside her, Nicole Cardano-Hillary, a bunch of other really good pieces, and Mackenzie Holmes, obviously. They have a chance to kind of carry this forward, and Allie Patberg gets to do it in the 7th year.
You kind of touched on it there with mentioning the bridges IU's been able to have with players, but I guess more culturally, I mean, when Terry Morin took over this program, it was one really with no success, very much in the shadow, both of the men's basketball program and Purdue in the state that's, been to a national championship this century and has had lots of success. How has she been able to do it over these past 7 years, really building from nothing to now having a team that looks like next year could compete for a national championship?
Yeah, I mean, it was just interesting when she was hired because Kurt Miller left very abruptly. He had this great recruiting class coming in with Tyra Buss and Amanda Cahill and a bunch of others. And, but his philosophy was offense first. I mean, when we talk about philosophies, his was very obvious. It was run and gun, and we're going to just score as many points as we can. Laren Brooks was another star of that team. She was actually an all Big Ten player as a freshman. And then Terry Morin came in, and it was a very opposite philosophy. It was we were going to play defense, and we're going to play defense really hard, and we're going to rebound. And that took time. I mean, that first year was a difficult year. I mean, they finished below 500. They didn't go to the postseason after a WNIT appearance the year before. It felt like kind of a step back. They had to kind of reestablish themselves and kind of from a place of kind of a really rough year for IU women's basketball, really rebound from that. And they did. I mean, that next year you go to the NCAA tournament, Tyra Buss and Amanda Cahill become what they are, and it starts rolling. And it's not that it's a complete up, like rocket going off into the sky. I mean, there was a step back there the next year to the WNIT. Then that next year when they win the WNIT, that it's Amanda Cahill and Tyra Buss surrounded by a bunch of freshmen because they had no depth. There were a ton of transfers. There was a ton of turnover, and it was difficult to establish that and get enough players to buy in. But over time, they did, and it kind of clicked into gear during that WNIT run, and they go and they win the whole thing, and then all of a sudden, there's just this real optimism around IU women's basketball. And it is built from there. I mean, been to the tournament pretty much every year since then. And it's, it's definitely having a philosophy, sticking to it, and then finding enough players that are willing to buy into it. And it took, I mean, I know a lot of people are kind of coming in on the bandwagon now, and it's like, looks like, oh man, this thing just really, took off. Wow. How did this happen? It happened over the course of like 6 or 7 years. And it's been a real grind. And, but no, again, Tyra Buss, Amanda Cahill, Brenna Wise, Allie Patberg, to now what is it next? Probably Grace Berger, Mackenzie Holmes, who were the freshmen after that. There seem to be these, it seems to be building in terms of the players you need to kind of step into each other's shoes. Has been happening over the last few years, and recruiting picks up, and now you go to an Elite Eight and you see where that takes you next. So it's definitely been an impressive job by the coaching staff, kind of infusing this culture and then players buying into it.
I know you covered the women's basketball team in the past, exclusively. And this is something, honestly, I'm just curious about. With Tyra Buss, been around the program the last couple of years. I am not sure I've seen an athlete at IU after they have left who is as popular as Tyra Buss is. I remember being at a game. She was doing color for BTN after the game. I mean, just a line across the court of people signing up to get interviews, photos, autographs. Why is she such a kind of, cultural hero for IU fans to a level that very few athletes have reached, I think, at their time at IU?
It's interesting because she was probably at that level before she came to IU. I mean, at Mount Carmel, she was kind of this traveling show. She scored about 40 points per game in high school. And so, a lot of people gravitated to her, and they were interested in her. And it's like, who is this uber scorer from Mount Carmel who's 5'7", not the strongest person in the world, wiry, but a lot of heart with the way she plays. And I think that's the thing that you saw on the floor from Tyra Buss is she wasn't the biggest person in the world, but she would attack the rim with a vengeance, kind of like El Durham, the way he is in terms of, sometimes just flopping on the floor, just always like going in hard and falling down. Tyra Buss did that a lot as a freshman, and it wasn't always pretty as a freshman. I mean, sometimes she would be throwing up layups and just like get absolutely just like knocked to the floor, and the thing was not even close. She got better as each year went on in terms of her effectiveness finishing around the rim. Great shooter. Played on both ends of the floor. I mean, I don't know if she was the best off the ball defender when she started, but then she got better and better and better at all aspects of the game. And yeah, and that cultural phenomenon, kind of, I guess you would call it, from high school, where she was already kind of this legend of a girls basketball player, it carried over to IU. And there were lines, I mean, after games, sophomore, junior year for her into her senior year, that were like 30 minutes long. I mean, she would have to stand there for 30 minutes and sign autographs from all these people that wanted to just get an autograph from Tyra Buss. And it's kind of amazing to watch from a women's basketball perspective, because obviously that following's been growing over the years. But yeah, I think it's just the way she played the game. Just, again, not being the biggest person in the world, but being so unafraid to kind of attack. And she had a tenaciousness about her. And yeah, that fan following just kind of followed her throughout her college career, going into now what she's a coach at Evansville now. Obviously, did a little color with BTN, but yeah, there's a love there. And then I always feel the need, though, to bring up Amanda Cahill, who is kind of her wing woman, I guess you would say. The just gritty player too. I mean, I think she got hit in the nose. May have had a messed up nose, may have broken it, kept playing, like sprained her ankle really bad, kept playing, hit all these 3-pointers, crafty around the basket. They just had these two players that fit each other perfectly and just played so hard on both ends. And I think that's why you get the kind of love that people have for them.
No, I appreciate you clearing that up. Honestly, I just seen it last year and was like, wow. I mean, you rarely see athletes with this much fanfare, especially, as you said, for a program in the past that doesn't have a whole lot of history. So I appreciate you clearing that up. Want to transition to the other sport that had a lot of success as well this year for IU, football, and they just completed their spring season, spring practice. Didn't have a spring game, but what's kind of the biggest storyline or biggest thing that you feel like we learned about this team going out of their spring practice?
Obviously, we didn't get to watch much of it because it was behind closed doors. There was no scrimmage. So, I mean, it's hard to say there's a ton of takeaways other than there's still a lot of hope and high expectations, I would say. I mean, I would say maybe that's the biggest thing, is that, they're talking about winning Big Ten championships now, which Tom Allen, says he's been talking about that since he got here, and people would laugh at him. I don't know if I was laughing or, if anybody else was laughing, like, actually, but he probably sensed that probably some people felt that way. Obviously, IU football had, not a great tradition, honestly. Obviously, one of the losingest programs in the history of college football. But he wanted that to be the aspiration, and now it feels like they're more and more openly talking about that. Dylan McCullough comes back from the Kansas City Chiefs. He's talking about, building a running back room that's going to, help them win Big Ten championships. And there's been more and more of that said, it feels like. It's moving the ball. It's kind of almost like the women's basketball program. I mean, it was, let's get to the tournament. And then it was like, okay, let's get to the Sweet 16. And now we're at the Elite Eight. And I'm sure now they're going to talk about going to Final Fours and winning national championships. I mean, that's the type of thing you try to do as a program. And that feels like where IU football's at. I mean, obviously, it was a strange year with COVID, and it was a conference-only schedule, and it's going to be back to something more closer to normal. And now the Penn States and the Michigans of the world, who you beat, or they've got a target on your back, so that there's going to be an interesting dynamic there. How do they handle that? But I think it definitely is, the lesson probably is just from hearing them talk, is that they got a ton of pieces coming back. Obviously, Michael Penix, we got to see how he recovers from an ACL, but they're optimistic about their ability not only to be good again, but build off of what they've already done and be in contention for things like a Big Ten championship, which they're talking about.
Want to touch on a couple sports that are still going on, believe it or not. I mean, we could have 2 more months of IU sports going on. Baseball, I know you've been covering a little bit. They've had a pretty wild start to their season, halfway through now, sitting 3rd place in the Big Ten. A lot of ups, a lot of downs for them. What's your kind of impression so far of Jeff Mercer's team and where they can go on their year?
Yeah, I mean they're a team with a lot of potential. They obviously had that really rough patch there with the 4-game sweep out of Ohio State and 5-game losing streak overall. But they really responded against Illinois, a combined no-hitter, which was the first since 1984 in the program. That shows you that they have a pretty good pitching staff. Obviously, McCade Brown earlier in the year set the single game record for strikeouts. He's a guy with really plus stuff when he's on. They got 3 starters with, you would say, Summer, Brown, and Bierman, who are all really, really quality arms. So they can win games with pitching, but every now and again, you'll see them do some explosive stuff with the bats. And I mean, obviously, Grant Richardson had that walk-off homer to win, a game earlier this year. Colin Hopkins did it this last weekend. There's definitely some all-around potential with this team. It's a young team in some ways, which is really interesting. I mean, they were starting upwards of 5 freshmen in the lineup, a handful of freshmen. So they definitely got guys who can produce now, but it's a team that could get better throughout the year as well. So they're a really interesting program to watch. They've obviously got things rolling. I know Jeff Mercer talks about building the monster or whatever. That's the saying. It seems like they're building something that's pretty has the potential to be pretty impressive this year and going forward.
Another team, maybe the team that has the most attention this weekend, is the IU men's soccer team. They're taking on Penn State in the Big Ten tournament championship game. And I know you haven't done a lot of coverage of them, but just from your perspective of covering college athletics, their consistency is just incredible. I mean, they have not lost a game against a Big Ten opponent at home since 2016, trying to continue that tomorrow. I mean, how do you build a program that is that consistent? What kind of impresses you about IU men's soccer?
Yeah, Jeremy Price does most of our soccer coverage, and I'm not Zach Osterman at the Star. I'm not tweeting about Liverpool, so I don't pretend to know a lot about soccer or even know the ins and outs of why this program is as great as it is, because I haven't really had a ton of time to cover them, but yeah, no, like you said, it's impressive. I mean, to be one of the best programs in the country at what you do, I mean, that's always impressive. And, I think obviously everybody's always so focused on men's basketball, football, even women's basketball now. You lose sight of the fact that you have one of the best men's soccer programs in the country on campus. And you have, one of the best baseball programs in the Big Ten at IU. I mean, there are a lot of really good, non-revenue sports that are on campus here. And yeah, Todd Yeagley's really good at his job. I don't think that's hard to say.
That is for certain. Now, 3-time Big Ten Coach of the Year, pretty remarkable. They're taking on Penn State tomorrow night, 5:00 on Big Ten Network. John, we've kind of touched on, some of the success for some teams. There's certainly been some remarkable moments this year. If you have to pick one, what would you say is the biggest moment or biggest game or play from IU sports in this year?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the lamest answer. It's probably the one that everybody gives. But I mean, the Penix, the reach for the pylon probably has to be the one that just stands out because it was the first game where they really did that. I mean, they've had so many moments in the past where they have just failed late against teams of that caliber. I mean, Ohio State, it's happened a few times. I mean, it happened against Penn State the year before out in Happy Valley. I mean, they were able to challenge, but they weren't able to really pull it out. And then, you're coming into this COVID season. You have no idea what anybody's going to look like. Michael Penix was terrible to start that game. He was absolutely awful. But then he, kind of turns it on. And then that last drive takes them down the field, 2-point conversion, ties it up. Before that, Penn State, the running back, Devin Ford, didn't get down at the 1-yard line, could have ran out the clock. And then you go into overtime, and you see him kind of rolling out there on that run. And I didn't think there was any way in heck he was getting there. I mean, honestly, it's just like you always expect those guys to close that distance. Maybe it's good that Micah Parsons wasn't out there with his 4.3 40 or something like that to chase him down. He reaches out. We're all the way up there in that press box. I can't see if the ball hit or didn't. And then, 2-point conversion, scored, win the game. I mean, that's just unbelievable, especially with what happened with the locker room after that, with Tom Allen doing the crowd surfing in the locker room. And, they continue to win games. They rise up the top 25 poll. They have the season they have. I mean, I feel like that has to be I mean, for me, just the moment of the year, just because that one play kind of encapsulates everything that was about to come and everything you didn't know was about to happen. Just because, again, I didn't know if he made it. We saw a bunch of different angles, photos of it. I know Penn State fans probably think he didn't make it, but it was definitely a heck of a play. I feel like that's the one that I always think of.
Certainly a moment that anyone involved with will never forget. As we start to look towards next year, Jon, I mean, we haven't seen IU fans, the public allowed at any games this season, just family members, and assume, through the next month, that will be the case. What is your kind of expectation for fan attendance, COVID policies in the fall for IU sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom Allen said it in availability this spring that his expectation is there will be fans in the stands. And it's like we were talking about at the beginning. I mean, there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, with vaccinations, you would expect if most people are vaccinated and the rate of COVID dips down to a substantial amount, that there obviously are going to be fans in the stands, whether it's 100%. I can't say that yet. I don't know if there'll be sellout crowds at Memorial Stadium or if it'll be 50% or what percentage, but I think there'll definitely be fans. I think kind of the age of the cutout's over. I mean, that's an interesting thing to me. I don't think we're going to be seeing anybody's cats and dogs on cardboard things anymore that we're watching in the middle of games and seeing out in the stands. But I think there's going to be fans, whether it's 100% or the fear is always that something could happen with COVID and there's more cases than ideal and they don't feel comfortable with everybody being packed together. But I think the hope is we're back to something closer to normal next year, and there definitely will be fans out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all very tired of seeing cardboard cutouts. Their novelty ran out. They ran out pretty fast, surprisingly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just a couple more questions for you, Jon. Outside of COVID regulations and looking at that, what do you see as the biggest storyline for IU athletics going into next year, whether a specific sport or player or something to watch?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one because I think obviously the two sports that I kind of cover the most, football and basketball, I think they're kind of equal in terms of, what's going to happen, the interest in each of them. Because again, football, are you going to be able to follow what you did last year? Are you going to be able to prove that wasn't a fluke? Are you going to, is Michael Penix going to come back healthy with the second ACL tear in that knee, come back and be the player he was? What's going to happen there? I mean, I think that's a huge storyline going forward. And then basketball, what is IU basketball going to be under Mike Woodson? I mean, we really don't know. I mean, there's a lot of optimism right now because of the people he's been able to keep and just his history with IU, excitement for an NBA coach and what he can bring. But you really don't know till you see it on the floor. I think everybody's remembering that with the Archie Miller hire. I mean, that was supposed to be the hottest coach under 40 years old in college basketball. He was going to be the one. I mean, this made all the sense in the world, and then just wasn't never able to get momentum. I mean, can IU basketball finally get some of that momentum under Coach Woodson? So I think it's kind of split. And then women's basketball. Hey, I mean, obviously you go to the Elite Eight. Can you push the ball forward? Like I was saying before, I mean, I think any of those three sports, there's definitely some interest. There's some excitement. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. Maybe I rambled for about 2 minutes to get there, but just that there is excitement across all of these programs right now in terms of what they can do, and kind of what's going to happen is the big question. And that's why we cover sports, because we don't know. It's always interesting to find out.
That's a good point. I mean, a lot of reasons to be excited if you are an IU fan going into next year. A lot of questions for certain. And you mentioned covering it. I mean, I've seen your coverage. You've done a great job all year with IU football and men's basketball. But I'd imagine it was very different as a reporter. What were kind of some of the challenges and experience that you had, and how do you kind of reflect on it as a journalist covering sports this year?
Yeah, I mean, obviously doing most of this stuff via Zoom, never being able to stand next to a person and ask a question. And I feel like I've been leaning into cameras for this for an entire year. I mean, that's always weird. I did not get into journalism as one of those people that wanted to be a personality. I just thought I'd be able to go into the press boxes and be at games and write. Nobody knew ever what I looked like. And so doing all these press conferences on Zoom and having people watch the press conference later and see my giant head in there was weird. Obviously, yeah, internet connection issues. If you ever have an internet connection problem, that's never been a problem before. But then trying to do interviews, it's like essential now. Obviously, traveling in a pandemic, went down to Tampa for the bowl game, being on a plane full of people with masks, and just trying to be careful and live your life, and just again, I think this is probably just something everybody experiences, just a lot of isolation, and just most of my interactions with people have been via Zoom in press conferences. I mean, that's just been my life, and at least they made it interesting. At least it wasn't, for the most part, a lot of losses. Basketball season was obviously tough, just because you don't like talking to people who aren't feeling good after losses, and especially over Zoom, where you can't really have eye contact with them to have any tone or understanding between the people of what we're trying to ask and why we're asking it. And it's just, yeah, it was a weird, awkward year, and I think we're all hoping that it gets back to normal, where we can just stand in front of people and talk to them again. That would be really nice.
Absolutely. Well, Jon, I hope I can see you in person in the press box next year, and really appreciate you taking some time and hopping on the podcast today.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me. We'll see you around.
That will do it for today's episode of the Unpaid Interns podcast. As always, if you missed any of today's podcast, you can check it out on the IU Sports Media YouTube or Twitter page. We'll be back. We will be off on Monday, so back later in the week for our next episode of the Unpaid Interns podcast. For Jon Blau, I'm Griffin Epstein. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great weekend, everyone.